That's fine. We were having a coffee emergency earlier. I hadn't had a coffee all day, so I was getting a little on edge. You'll have to excuse me, you're going to hear a sentence you don't hear very often, but I just got a new pair of legs. And I only got them fitted yesterday, and it's kind of, you get used to your own legs, obviously. And then when you get a new pair, my first new pair in 4 years, I feel like I'm a drunk person now, because I don't feel like my legs. So if I'm staggering around looking like I'm drunk, it's my legs, I promise. I was thrilled to be asked to come and talk at this event today because stories are my life. Stories mean everything to me. I follow in a tradition of storytelling that started tens of thousands of years ago in caves around fires. A story tradition that has carried on through poetry, through painting, and for me, through photography. So today I want to tell you a story, and I want to tell you some of the stories that I've captured, told in my work. But we'll begin with a small gift. An Olympus OM10 camera and a book by the war photographer Don McCullum. When I was 18 years old, I was on a state sports scholarship in the States. I was the world's worst boxer. I thought I was really good. I remember my coach saying to me, "Giles, you take a punch really well." As an 18-year-old, you believe everything's a compliment. I kind of walked away thinking, realized he probably didn't mean it was a good thing. But sport was my life, and I'd gone to the States to pursue that. And then I had a car accident. It was just a minor car accident, but it was enough to put me in hospital, and I was told I would never play any kind of sport again. I came back to the UK, found myself in hospital for a long time, and I became very depressed, very angry. As I say, an 18-year-old, everything was about sport. I'd failed at school. Suddenly that was taken away from me. What was I going to do? And that's when my godfather passed away, my godfather Barry. And his widow brought me two things that he'd bought the week that he died. One was this Olympus OM10 camera, and the other was the book by the war photographer Don McCullum, a small gift that was going to change my story. I grew up in a house, my parents weren't really interested in art, they weren't really interested in photography or the news, so I'd never seen photographs like Don McCullum's, black and white images of the wars in Vietnam, Biafra, famines in Bangladesh and Sudan. And as an 18-year-old, I suddenly found myself looking at these photographs, these stories, and I was so moved. I used to wake up in the middle of the night and have to take the book off the shelf and have to look at those pictures again. And to this day, if I shut my eyes, I can still see those photographed. So there and then I decided that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a war photographer like Don McCullum. So I had this Olympus camera, and I got some rolls of film, and I actually taught myself photography lying in a hospital bed. I used to photograph the doctors, the nurses, my friends, anything I could photograph. Obviously, as an 18-year-old, I mainly photographed the nurses. That's how I kind of became a photographer. And I left full of good intentions to travel the world as a war photographer. But I had a few friends that were in bands. I moved to Bristol, and they asked me if I'd take some photographs of their gigs and some album covers. And kind of by accident, suddenly magazines were ringing me up and asking me, "Do you want to go and photograph Oasis? Do you want to go and photograph this band?" And I got sidetracked pretty much. Sidetracked for almost a decade. But it was a good sidetracking. I remember my Auntie Margaret, a very stern Scottish woman, she was looking through some of the pictures that I was doing of bands like the Charlatans and Marilyn Manson, Lenny Kravitz, and she was looking at all this fashion work that I was also doing, and she said, "Giles, I thought you wanted to be a serious photographer. Because what are you doing hanging out with all these bands and models? What went wrong?" And I was kind of like, "Well, Auntie Margaret, I've got to be honest." I said, "I'm just doing this for the beautiful women and great parties." And she's like, "Seriously, Giles?" And I was like, "I'm 19 years old. This is a legitimate reason for a career path." And it was, and I loved it. But as the years went on, I became increasingly disillusioned by the industry that I was working in. I became sick of celebrity culture. As a fashion photographer, I also became sick of the way the women were portrayed in a lot of the magazines that I was working for. And then one day, it actually came to a rock and roll climax. After a decade of working as a fashion photographer, I had a big hissy fit. In the middle of a photo shoot in the Charlotte Street Hotel, not far from here, I took my cameras and I threw them all out the window. It was kind of, a shoot that was going on. There was an editor kind of arguing with a young model, a young actress, about her state of undress. That was the moment, as I say, when they were having this discussion. The model was almost in tears, that I sat there and I said, you know what? This is not why I became a photographer. Got the cameras, threw them out the window, walked out. Well, anybody who knows me knows I'm not that rock and roll. It was a minor hissy fit. I did say, that's it, I'm done, but I just threw them on the bed. Because really, I'm more of a kind of Radio 4 in the evening guy. It's just unfortunate they happened to bounce out the window. So everyone else saw the cameras flying out the window. But it was a symbolic and a complete end, really, to my photographic career. I was only 28 years old, but I really thought my life, certainly as a photographer, was over. I thought I had completely messed up the opportunities that I had. And I had no idea what I was going to do next. I moved out of London, moved down to Hastings. I got a job in a bar. I say a job in a bar. My main job was to drink everything in the bar. I sunk further and further into a depression. I really was at the lowest point in my life. In many ways, I questioned whether I wanted to live. And then I remembered that small gift. I remembered the Olympus OM10 camera, and I remembered the book of Don McCullen's photographs, and I got them out, and I looked at this book again, and I reminded myself, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a storyteller. So I sold my flat, I moved to Angola, and I started to document the war there, and I started work with some NGOs and some charities. And suddenly I had found what it is that I'd set out to do 10 years before. For over a decade, I documented not really war, but the effects of war. I'm not really interested in people firing guns. I'm interested in what happens to the civilians caught up in those conflicts. As I say, I've been doing that for about a decade, and I was working in Afghanistan. I was documenting the life of a group of American soldiers. My normal instinct, as I say, is not to photograph soldiers. I'm not interested in that side of things. But I was interested in the impact the war was actually having on the soldiers themselves. At that point, more American soldiers were killing themselves than were actually dying in Afghanistan. While I was doing that work, we were out on patrol one day, and I stepped on a landmine. I lost both my legs, I lost my arm. I remember lying there. It was a kind of beautiful sunny morning, and I was lying there looking at this tree, and I could see my legs in the tree, thinking, that's not a good sign. But miraculously, I survived. I was flown back to Birmingham, where I spent the next 46 days in intensive care. It was touch and go through those 46 days, whether I'd make it. My family was called in twice to say their goodbyes. My lungs stopped working, my kidneys stopped working, my heart stopped working. Pretty much every organ I had at some point gave up, but my stubbornness didn't quite. And at the end of 46 days, I was well enough to be moved to the high dependency unit there in Birmingham. But actually, that's when things got really tough, because that's when I was told I would never walk again, I would never live independently, and there was no question, but I would never work again. Everything that was precious to me was taken away. I remember 3 months after I got injured, I was well enough for the first time to be put in a wheelchair and taken to have a shower. It was the first time I saw myself in a full-length mirror. And I saw my arms missing, my leg. I had a lot of internal injuries. I had lost a lot of weight after 2 months in intensive care. I remember I burst into tears. It was suddenly that reality came crashing down. I was repulsed by what I saw. I was disgusted by myself. And I went to bed that night, and in tears, I remember thinking to myself, I wish I just died on that helicopter. It would have been a lot easier for everybody. I wish I just never kind of got through it. I couldn't deal with this new reality. But then in the morning, again, at my lowest point, I remembered that small gift. And I remember that camera, and I remembered that book. And I said to myself, Giles, if you can find any way to take a photograph again, none of this would matter. If you could find a way to tell somebody else's story, or even tell your own story, your injuries would be meaningless. And so I resolved there and then that I would find a way to take a photograph. I was already trying to work out a way to put a camera in a wheelchair. My sister, bless her, was like there through the whole year I was in hospital, was kind of going, why don't you just not worry about that right now? We'll get through the other 37 operations. It's like, no, but I could do this and then I could go back to Afghanistan. She's like, you're not going back to Afghanistan in a wheelchair with a camera strapped to it. A couple of weeks after I got injured, the beginning of the Syrian civil war began. As I was going through my recovery, I would watch on television every day the growing crisis. My friends that worked in charities and NGOs were telling me about what was going on. Even at that stage, when I was in hospital and I was trying to work out how I could put a camera on a wheelchair, I knew that this was a story that I had to be telling. At that point, it wasn't that well known in the public over here, but I knew that I wanted to be there to document what was happening, because for me, this was the biggest crisis of my career. 2 years after my injury, I was well enough to be walking again, and one of the first places I decided to go was to Lebanon, because I wanted to document some of the most vulnerable Syrian refugees that were living there. People with disabilities, single mothers, the elderly. I felt nobody could tell their story better than I could, because quite literally, I had walked in the footsteps as many of them had. I went there in 2012 to document stories like Khaloud's. Khaloud had been working in her garden in Syria. The area where she lived was under siege, so they were very short of fruit and vegetables, so she was growing them in her own garden. She was out there with her kids when a sniper shot her in the spine. She fell paralyzed in front of her children. Her family managed to get her to a hospital. She got emergency treatment, and then they got her out into Lebanon. She was paralyzed from the neck down. When I met her, she was living in this makeshift tent in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon. If you imagine a tetraplegic person who needs full-time medical support, living in basically a shack made out of cardboard with a tin roof, with only her husband to be her full-time carer. I remember saying to Khaloud, what is your hope for the future? Do you have a hope for the future? And she said, Giles, I just want to be a mother again. And she would describe to me how when her kids were playing outside on the gravel, one of them would fall over and scratch themselves. And like any kid, they would run into their mother and they would say, Mummy, make it better. And they would pick up her lifeless hand, which she couldn't feel, and put it on the wound, as any child would. And it broke her heart. I met women like Reem. Reem had been again at home in Syria when a rocket hit her house as she slept. Her husband was killed in the bed next to her. One of her children died in the room next door, and she lost her leg. Again, when I met her, she was living on the 4th floor of an unfinished building in Lebanon. Because of her new prosthetic leg, she was unable to leave because she couldn't go up and down the stairs. She was quite literally trapped on this rooftop. She didn't have her children living with her because she felt so ashamed. She didn't want them to see her like this. The only person that lived with her was her father. I was doing this portrait of him. Most of my portraits, the people are always looking directly at the camera. But as I was taking his photograph, he kept looking out to the side, and I was trying to work out, why are you looking that way? And then he explained to me, and he said the reason why they lived on this rooftop in Lebanon, he said, look, over there in the distance, those mountains are Syria. He goes, I'm an old man. I will probably never return to my homeland. But at least every morning when I wake and when I go to bed at night, the last thing I see is my home. And on that trip, I also met a young girl called Aya. Now, I don't like to photograph people as victims. It's very difficult in my job. I see people in very, very difficult circumstance, but I don't like to portray them as victims of circumstance, but not as victims in their own right. With Aya, though, I was challenged. Aya, when I met her, was 4 years old. She has spina bifida, meaning she's paralyzed from the waist down. I met her, again, in Lebanon, living in a makeshift tent. It was damp. She was on the concrete floor. She could hardly sit upright. I walked in there. I was on my own at first. And I looked at her, and she looked so pitiful. And I thought to myself, if I just take a photograph of her, I'm exploiting the position she's in. It would make her seem like this victim. So I said to the team I was with, I said, I can't photograph Aya. I can't take this photograph. But I said, if it's okay, I'll still spend the day here and spend some time with people. Well, I was completely and utterly wrong. Aya is not a victim. Aya was actually the feistiest 4-year-old I've ever met in my life. She pretty much ran not just her family, but the whole refugee camp. The first indication I got was actually when her sister, Aman, came in, who's 12 years old. And her mother, Aya's mother, said, if you're going to take Aya's photograph, you should re-photograph her with her sister. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, it's a very beautiful story. What happened is when the house was being bombed, Aman saved her sister. She grabbed Aya, and she ran to the basement with her, and she held her tightly. And for 3 or 4 days, the house was bombed. She never let go of her. I was thinking, wow, that's such a beautiful relationship with these two sisters. And then she told me after that, it took them 3 months to reach Lebanon. And again, the whole journey, Aman held Aya in her arms and carried her that whole way. And I said to Aya, wow, that's a really beautiful story. You must love your sister very much. She looked at me and she said, my sister's a donkey. I was like, what? And at that moment, her sister was there, and she was just like, hey, donkey, pick me up. So Aman carried Aya, and they went. And as I say, I realized that this was the way that Aya was. So eventually, after weeks of going back and getting to know the family, I was able to take this photograph, which really summed up the relationship that they had. And in this, for me at least, Aya was not a victim. The way I see it is if you have a 4-year-old with spina bifida living as a refugee in a camp, I don't need to explain to you that their life is pretty shit. What I wanted to show was Aya's spirit. Last October, I was commissioned by the UNHCR to document the refugee crisis across Europe and the Middle East. They commissioned me for 7 months. They gave me one of the greatest briefs anybody's ever been given. They simply said, Giles, follow your heart. I began the project in Lesbos, documenting some of the scenes that we've been talking about earlier today. But I knew that if I was really going to follow my heart, I would have to go back to Lebanon, and I would have to retrace some of those families that I had met there 2 years before. So earlier this year, I was back in Lebanon and tracking down a lot of the families. This is Reem's father. I always like to take photographs back if I can, but it's a real pain in the arse. Trying to take a photograph halfway around the world when you've got no legs and one arm and you're trying to carry all your camera equipment. So anyway, I get there, I give him the photograph, and he just looked at me and he went, you made me look really old in this. I was like, well, there's gratitude for you. But I was pleased to see that Reem has her daughter living with her on the rooftop now. She's learned to walk better. Her brother also lives there with the kids. Her sister-in-law helps cook. But of course, life is not normal. There is no normality to the situation. Speaking to Sarah, Reem's daughter, I said a question like you would say to a lot of kids. What's your favorite subject at school? What do you like to do there? And she said, well, I don't go to school. I have no friends. And for over 3 years, she had no school and has never played with any other children. Like many refugees, she lives in isolation. And of course, I went back and I saw Aya and her family. Aya was exactly the same. This is her being pushed by her brother, screaming, faster, donkey, faster. But again, things are not quite the same. They're stuck in a limbo. Their parents, Shehan and Aman, aren't able to work. The children aren't able to attend school. Like most refugees living in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, their life is on hold. On the last day I was there, I got a phone call. I'd managed to track down most of the families that I'd first seen there, but obviously not everybody. But I got a phone call, and it was from Khaloud's family. Khaloud, the woman who had been shot by a sniper and paralyzed. And they said, Khaloud's heard you're here. She would love you to come and visit. And I was like, well, yeah, that's great. Where is she? And they said, well, she's in the same tent. And I remember my heart stopped. I felt physically sick. I kind of repeated the question. I said, where is she? And they said, the same tent where you last saw her. And I remember thinking of all the people I'd met in my work in recent times. Nobody was in more desperate need of help than Khaloud. And 2 years later, she was still in the same makeshift tent without any support. I thought, what the hell is the point? in my job? Why tell stories? Why do the work if nothing changes, if the life is exactly the same? I went to visit them, and I walked in, and I burst into tears. And I turned to Khulud, and I said, I failed you. Her husband, Jamal, gave me a hug, and we talked. I said, no, you haven't failed us. But in my heart, I thought, what is the point in all the things we've been talking about today here in telling stories? If you tell a story, and somebody is in that same situation. But I decided there's only one thing I could do, and that was to tell her story better and tell it again. Because if you believe in a story, you have to keep telling it until people hear it. So over the next week, I spent my time there documenting the daily life. As I say, it's a place where there's a lot of humanity despite everything that goes on. It's always laughter. The children are doing really well in school. They sit in the bed. They learn with Khulud. Despite everything, you imagine she hasn't moved from that bed in a room that has no windows. She just stares at the same ceiling. And yet her spirit is as amazing as ever. And her relationship with Jamal. And on the last day, I had to make a decision. As with all the other people, I'd taken the photograph back that I'd originally done. And I said, do I give this to them? Do I give them the picture of them in the same situation that they are 2 years later, her paralyzed lying in this bed? And I thought, well, I have to. But I handed over this photograph that I'd taken of them 2 years before. And I said, when I took this photograph, I did not take a photograph of a refugee. I did not take a photograph of a disabled person. This was a photograph of a couple who are so deeply in love with each other. And that's what I wanted to capture. Of course, we all burst into tears at that stage. But stories have an incredible power to change. They have a mojo, a juju, that none of us really understand. A couple of weeks ago, I got a phone call from somebody in the States. They said, we heard a story that you told. And I said, which one was it? And they said, Khulud's. And they said, and we've raised some money. And it turned out they'd raised £250,000 for me to take over and get her put into full medical care. And that's the power of a story. None of us own stories. I don't own Khulud's story. It belongs to Khulud. But I can be a caretaker, and I can pass it on. I want to finish my story today with a small gift, an Olympus OM10 camera, and a book by the war photographer Don McCullen. An incredibly small gift that would have a huge impact on my life and my story. Last year, I got a letter from a young man in Australia, a guy called Mark, and it just said, Dear Mr. Duley, I wanted to let you know I got into Brisbane Medical School. I was like, well, good for you, mate. I then read on a bit more, and he said, I struggled at school. I was told I wasn't bright enough. I was told I would never make it. I had problems at home. But I got into the top 1% of my class, and I got a scholarship to become a surgeon at Brisbane Medical School. And I wanted to thank you, because it's one of the photographs you'd taken that inspired me to become a surgeon. And I had it on my wall, and every day when I struggled at school, every day when I was struggling at home, I'd look at that photograph, and it reminded me of what I was doing. So even 25 years later, after that small gift was given to me, its impact was being felt on the other side of the world in somebody else's life. Each one of us, every day, creates ripples of change. Each one of us does things that has actions we will never see. But we have to believe that each one of those ripples is there and is creating change. Because a story can do that. Thank you.